Emergency call center.
My baby, he has a strong fever and has been screaming for hours. I don't know what to do anymore, it just doesn't get any better. I have the feeling he's glowing. Please help him.
Stay calm, help is on the way.
Welcome, dear viewers, to our show, Emergency Action. As you probably already guessed from the intro, today we're talking about children's fever. Today, in my studio, I have none other than the chief physician of the Swiss Mountain Clinic, Dr. Petra Wiechel. Welcome, dear Petra.
Thank you.
Now, on the subject of fever, I would like to know, when do you speak of mild fever, and when is it really increased fever?
First of all, you have to assume that we have operating temperature. Operating temperature, where the body is actually able to perform all its functional life tasks, is about 36.8 to 37.3 degrees Celsius. And everything that is above 37.5, 37.6 would already mean mild fever, an increased temperature. But an increased fever is then well above 38.5 degrees Celsius.
And at what temperature, one could say, does it become dangerous? So 38.5, I assume that's not the case yet.
Yes, so between 38.5 degrees Celsius, and now, of course, you also have to distinguish between a child and an adult. I would say, everything that is above 40 already needs certain care.
And are there also differences in the children? So, for example, if a baby is less than 3 months old has fever, is that less or worse than a child who is already 2 or 3 years old?
Well, maybe we have to look at it differently first. So fever is not at all comparable to illness. Fever is the process that the body creates to now build up its own immune defense. And it is quite natural that a child, a small child, a growing child, of course, builds up its own immune defense through these fever reactions. That means, with every increase in temperature, a process is always linked. The body never makes a mistake, and it doesn't do anything for a nonsensical reason. That means, if it is confronted with a strain at that moment, whether it is viral or bacterial, then it starts the process of fever, which now provides thousands of enzymes, which now brings the first series of immune defenses, the white blood cells in an incredibly high number, but also activity, which, of course, now has the task of recognizing the so-called enemy and simply eliminating it. That means, if the body is not allowed to do this task, because you, as a mother, may be afraid of the fever, then you would give it these options. For example, a chemical fever juice in a child at 38.5 degrees, for example, would immediately regulate the process to 36.8 or 37. But the disease process is still going on. That means, the body actually wants the fever to rise again so that it can activate all these processes. And children who have the opportunity to have this fever are actually the ones who play outside on the street after 3 or 4 days again. But the children who are not allowed to do this, juggle between up and down, and the increase in temperature of these microorganisms is of course no longer given in the fever. That means, the body clears up over 38.5 degrees. And that's huge and with sense and understanding.
I have also already heard that, apparently, I don't know if that's exactly true, but that the immune system increases by a degree of body temperature, or half a degree. So it becomes twice as strong.
Twice as strong in its activity, but also twice as little when you go into the lower temperature. That's right. That's why you actually have a fever to accompany well. That means, if I have a child now and the smaller they are, the faster they go up. And the more reactively the system can adapt adaptively, it will also do that via fever. And then I actually only have the task of observing this fever. That means, if I have a child now and it gets into the fever, then you will notice it. That means, it's very hot everywhere. Really hot, it glows. And I don't have to enforce this heat by packing the child properly. But I have to pack it lightly now, so that the body can cool down a little. And the means of choice for children is always ferrum phosphoricum. That's the organic Schussler mineral number 3. And ferrum iron, you know that, when the iron conducts. For example, if I touch an iron pan, which is also hot. Or I touch a pole outside, a lantern pole made of iron. When it's very cold, my hand sticks to it. That means, iron conducts. And I use that when I give a child ferrum phosphoricum in the form of globuli. Or in C6 or C12. Or I give it as a Schussler mineral, as a tablet, dissolve it. The child can drink it. But I would first go into this regulation. That means, don't take the chance on the body and don't lower it to 36, 38, 37. But I slowly regulate into the fever. And now I can leave it to its working temperature, which it needs. That means, I can leave it so that it doesn't rise any further. Or regulate it down a bit. But don't intervene massively in this process. And thus leave the body outside. Because the defense, the strength, if I have defense forces, if I can form defense or autoantibodies, then the next time the body will recognize it. And then you're not sick anymore. Because you've already built up your antibodies against it. And children have to be allowed to have this experience. Because that makes them strong for life. That makes them resistant. And I think our task as mothers is to have this time for them. And to accompany them on this process. And I wouldn't say that too often. These are very physiological reactions that the organism then makes. It also builds up a lot of defense without us getting sick. But if it is allowed to go through these processes, then in the long run you will come to a very good stability. Because you build the foundation in childhood. Later in adulthood you have to make sure that you keep it. And in old age you have to be allowed to use these reserves.
What other emergency solutions are there? As a mother, I have a child at home who has a fever. There is also the well-known calf compresses.
Yes, of course. The important thing is that I also make sure that the child drinks well. Because of the fever, a lot of liquid is also evaporated. And that it drinks a lot. I can also put a splash of lemon in the water. Or cut up a lot of fruit and vegetables for the child. This is important. Because the body does not want to be burdened by metabolism, by muffins or jam bread. It wants to work actively. That means it has to drink enough. And if it doesn't have an appetite, it's not that bad. The body can regulate this process much faster if it concentrates on it. And if it is supported in this process. And then I can regulate the fever by making small calf compresses. The cloths are soaked in cold water and put around the legs. And then I do this for 10 to 20 minutes. And then it is taken off again. And wrap the calves again after 2 hours. So that whenever the blood runs through the legs, a certain temperature is regulated. But gently. Really gently. And maybe every hour on the first day. If the child gets 5-globulin or a Schussler mineral tablet, then you will notice that it improves a disease course. Where the body can work, of course. But the child does not get into a dramatic situation. Nature also takes the time it needs to do this process.
And this ferrum, do I get it in every pharmacy?
You get it in every pharmacy. There are also many good books about the Bio-Schussler minerals. And there is a range of support. But ferrum phosphoricum is the fever or inflammatory agent number 1. And it is always the first choice. In addition, there is also the monkshood, the aconite. These are also globulins. I always like to give them to the children when they are a bit inflamed at the throat. But as a secondary effect, it also has the fever regulation. But as I said, not suddenly down by 1 to 2 degrees, but it regulates this fever process.
So these are certainly 2 things that belong to every mother's home pharmacy.
Exactly. And also the sour cherry juice or the elderberry juice, which you then keep ready to give to the children. These are actually processes that are incredibly good in the long term. And above all, this fear-taking. Fever is nothing to worry about. On the contrary, we work a lot on the whole body hypothermia with adults, because we simply see that adults can no longer produce a fever.
I once saw in a program that they had a child who had a headache, mild fever, and they made a lemon wrap. What do you think is useful for this?
Yes, of course. I mean, this is the high-dose vitamin C in any form. You can of course make it locally as a wrap, of course. But much better would be the lemon in the water. Because the lemon has high vitamin C, of course. Vitamin C is also broken down quite quickly. That means it doesn't make sense to take excessively high doses. It can also be ascorbic acid or lemon juice. But always offer it over the day.
I read online, there was a counselor for mothers. It said that if a baby has a fever of less than 3 months, you have to go to the hospital immediately. How do you see that? When is it really time to say, okay, my child has been feverish for several days, or it has such a high temperature, I have to go to the GP right away, or even to the hospital?
Any way to the hospital would always mean first an emergency and then a symptomatic throttling. And fever in the sense of a viral activation, that the body starts its immune defense, can also happen with the baby. That's not a question at all. And you always have to look at the overall state. If the baby screams of discomfort, then there can also be a middle ear inflammation behind this fever. I very often observe that especially when it is warm for us as adults, that we think the baby is also warm now, and they are lying in the car. Sometimes they sit unprotected with a hat. 70% of the body heat is lost over the head. The head is the warmest thing we have in our body. And children do not have the tolerance to maintain this temperature compared to a cooler environment. That means that very quickly, with a worse circulation, post-traumatic, in the sense of a hypothermia, can also develop an otitis, an ear inflammation. That is why it is very important that we maintain this warmth for the children. And if you now take the fever as a sign of this, the body starts a process, but the child is very restless. Or somehow there is a problem in the stomach, crying, or diarrhea, and so on. This should not exclude that you go to the doctor. If you have a happy child, but you have an increased temperature, then there are sometimes processes that happen from 1 hour to the next with this little one. And the entrances, the mucous membranes, when a child is breastfed, then it has the defense of the mother. Then it is also protected against a lot of things. The mother has antibodies against measles viruses. The mother gives so much immune power through the mother's milk. This is actually the lesser problem. The child also has a certain nest protection. This is not so closely in contact with life. But if it is still the case, then it's not the first way, but the observation of the mother. Because the mother knows her child very well. And when it comes to the process of teething, for example, there are sometimes nights when you can't sleep through, but you observe, there is something in the jaw, something will break through. And sometimes this is also partly related to a fever reaction. So as long as I can explain this as a mother and maybe accompany this fever as a mother, then of course that is not a problem that I have to go to the doctor with. But I have to have the child in view and see that it is not an angina developing or a middle ear inflammation. Or it develops a cough and I don't know if it's just an infection. Then I can have the child be looked at the next day.
So if you were to summarize everything very briefly, you can say that it is better to regulate with children, but not to suppress the temperature. And actually, as long as the child is doing well and is not just screaming in pain, can you actually save yourself going to the doctor?
Yes, above all, I just have to observe. Children are sometimes allowed to be sick. And I always find that children have to go to the doctor when the doctor helps. And the best doctor is actually the mother first, because she knows her child best. And if she needs help, then I go. But not just, my child has a fever, because viral infections simply are like this. And it's interesting that if you have a high fever, even up to 39.5, which is not at all unlikely, even with babies or children up to 3 years old, they are sluggish, they are tired, they sleep a lot, but they have a nice fever, they drink well, are simply exhausted. Then there are children where you suddenly sit in the morning, they sit in bed and laugh and play. Everything is gone, everything is over again, and life takes its normal course. So you have to look at the symptoms. For example, aconite as a fever pill is also available in stores for the little ones. Or Vibrocol, that makes them so relaxed. And especially when teething, and also seems to regulate. These are things that are so nice to support in these phases. You must not forget, a small child, when it is born, his whole microenvironment has to build up first. And then it does go through such paths. There it is sick, or fever, it gets sick. It is a process that the child is now doing to really build up his own defense for life.
Well, then I would like to ask as a mother, how do I measure the fever of my children? It goes under the armpits, or in the mouth, or does the fever thermometer have to be in the anus?
Yes, that's right. A lot has happened now. In the past, it was common to measure armpits. Today you do it very easily. You can put it in your ear. It goes through this electronic fever thermometer. You can even measure it while sleeping. If you measure rectal, it is slightly higher than if you measure under the armpits or in the ears. But these are small differences that make no difference on the whole. And if you have subfebrile temperatures again and again with the child, sometimes it is less, sometimes it is more, but it is always a latent, increased temperature. If you observe it for a long time, the children are tired, these are things that you have to clarify. But not in an acute state. In the acute state, You can see with the body that it is in good strength to clarify this alone. And that makes the child strong and big.
Well, then I have one last question. Statistically, there is more fever compared to adults. Where does this come from? Is this just for the development of the immune system?
Exactly, of course. An adult, as part of his childhood and his growing up, has to go through all these processes. And we are inclined, in terms of medicine, to take more and more of the children. I think we could to that with vaccinations. But nothing is as good as to build up a healthy immune defense. And then, of course, you sometimes need these phases of illness. It is incredible what the body can do with a flu-like infection and what it can do to you. And to have this infection as an adult and to accompany it with fever is already a great rarity today. And I would not want to say that this is good. I would wish, and I am always happy when I ask, when people say no, I have a real viral infection but I encounter it with fever. This is very rare. But children must first come to a certain defense and are still very capable, because here you say if someone regulates, he works. That is why homeopathy also works so well. Because there is nothing that disturbs this process. It is different with adults. On the one hand, they certainly have a certain defense, but on the other hand, people are so heavily burdened today. Even if you are alone in a Wi-Fi network or in another network of mobile radio radiation, the sensitivity of your leukocytes is reduced. We did this study. And the leukocytes are those, as I said, that go up massively when they perceive that there is an infection or a viral or bacterial burden. And that actually takes away from adults the tendency to encounter such a process with fever in a viral or bacterial situation. I am really surprised how few, or even tumor patients, have had no infection for 10 or 15 years and have never had a fever. Then this is something that we should really give back the ability to humans, to the organism, so that it can do these processes on its own.
Is there anything else you would like to say to every mother out there, from our viewers?
I was a country doctor for a long time, and when I was called, for God's sake, my child has high fever, then I went there quickly, because I just wanted to be able to help her become a fearless mother and that she has this process in her hand to accompany her well. And I think with every new process, especially with the first child, it is of course all new and different, and above all you learn that there is nothing that we always have to get rid of or that we have to reduce. Fever is one of the most important things that life has given us, so that the body always remains in balance and knows best what it has to do and what it should and should not. And we must not rely on that 100%, but 1000%.
You heard it. A child may have high fever, and you can also let the child have a little fever. Regulating is required here and not just suppressing. I look forward to the next program and see you soon.